The sole exception was that, at Dr. Kissinger's request, I would not use quotations from his private papers that contained sensitive personal information. I'm glad to say that he exercised this right on only a handful of occasions, and always in connection with purely personal and indeed intimate familial matters. This book has been just over 10 years in the making. Throughout this long endeavour, I believe I have been true to my resolve to write the life of Henry Kissinger as it actually was, wie es eigentlich gewesen, in Ranker's famous phrase, which is perhaps better translated, as it essentially was. Ranker believed that the historian's vocation was to infer historical truth from documents. Not a dozen documents, the total number cited in one widely read book about Kissinger, but many thousands. I certainly cannot count how many documents I and my research assistant Jason Rockett have looked at in the course of our work. I can count only those that we thought worthy of inclusion in our digital database. The current total of documents is 8,380, a total of 37,645 pages. But these documents are drawn not just from Kissinger's private and public papers. In all, we have drawn material from 111 archives all around the world, ranging from the major presidential libraries to obscure private collections. A full list of those consulted for this volume is provided in the sources. There are, of course, archives that remain closed and documents that remain classified. However, compared with most periods before and since, the 1970s stand out for the abundance of primary sources. This was the age of the Xerox machine and the audio tape recorder. The former made it easy for institutions to make multiple copies of important documents, increasing the probability that one of them would become accessible to a future historian. Nixon's and Kissinger's fondness for the latter, combined with the expansion of freedom of information that followed Watergate, ensured that many conversations that might never have found their way into the historical record are now freely available for all to read. My motivation in casting the widest and deepest possible net in my trawl for material was straightforward. I was determined to see Kissinger's life not just from his vantage point, but from multiple vantage points, and not just from the American perspective, but from the perspectives of friends, foes, and the non-aligned. Henry Kissinger was a man who, at the height of his power, could justly be said to bestride the world. Such a man's life requires a global biography. I always intended to write 2 volumes. The question was where to break the story. In the end, I decided to conclude the first volume just after Richard Nixon announced to the world that Kissinger was to be his national security advisor, but before Kissinger had moved into his office in the West Wing basement and actually started work. There were 2 reasons for this choice. First, at the end of 1968, Henry Kissinger was 45 years old. As I write, he is 91. So this volume covers more or less exactly the first half of his life. Second, I wanted to draw a clear line between Kissinger the thinker and Kissinger the actor. It is true that Kissinger was more than just a scholar before 1969. As an advisor to presidents and presidential candidates, he was directly involved in the formulation of foreign policy throughout the 1960s. By 1967, if not before, he had become an active participant in the diplomatic effort to begin negotiations with the North Vietnamese government in the hope of ending the Vietnam War. Yet he had no experience of executive office. He was more a consultant than a true advisor, much less a decision-maker. Indeed, that was former President Dwight Eisenhower's reason for objecting to his appointment. "But Kissinger is a professor," he exclaimed when he heard of Nixon's choice. "You ask professors to study things, but you never put them in charge of anything. I'm going to call Dick about that." Kissinger was indeed a professor before he was a practitioner. It therefore makes sense to consider him first as what I believe he was before 1969, one of the most important theorists about foreign policy ever to be produced by the United States of America. Had Kissinger never entered government, this volume would still have been worth writing, just as Robert Skidelsky would still have had good reason to write his superb life of John Maynard Keynes, even if Keynes had never left the courtyards of Cambridge for the corridors of power in His Majesty's Treasury. It was in London, in a bookshop, that Boswell first met Johnson. My first meeting with Kissinger was also in